Welcome to the Boswell Book Company virtual event series. We are so honored to host AJ Pearce for her novel, Yours Cheerfully, the follow-up to Dear Mrs. Bird, which was a Boswell favorite. You probably had us tell you about the book and say you can't put it in your hands and say you can't let it go. And that was only partly due to the glue that we put on the cover. This new book is the continuing story of young wartime advice columnist Emmy Lake. Reviews have been spectacular for the new book. Minneapolis Star-Tribune says, as with Dear Mrs. Bird, the women in this book are more interesting than the men, but perhaps that is one of the points of the book, that the war propelled women out of their traditional roles and into the mess of life, while the men kept a stiff upper lip and carried on. And one author, Janet Skeslien Charles, the author of the Paris Library, said that Yours Cheerfully is an absolute delight. I love Dear Mrs. Bird and was thrilled to spend more time with Emmy and Bunty in Yours Cheerfully. Pearce shines a light on the hardships that women factory workers faced during World War II, an echo to the plight of working mothers today. Endearing, poignant, and relevant, this uplifting novel is a treat. And what do you know? Janet Skeslien Charles is here to talk to AJ Pearce about her book. Now, let me just mention a few things about the event before we start. We're on Zoom webinar, which means you don't have, your camera isn't on, your microphone isn't on, but you can hear and see everything. You also have the opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A function. And if you have comments or enthusiastic things to say, which I'm sure you do, please put that in the chat. If you put a comment in the chat, question in the chat function, I might send you a little note that says, please put it in the Q&A function, because it's tough to get to look at everything and also have a delightful conversation. I just want to mention that AJ Pearce studied at the University of Sussex and Northwestern University. A chance discovery of a 1939 women's magazine became the inspiration for her bestseller, Dear Mrs. Bird. Janet Skeslien Charles is the author of The Paris Library and Moonlight in Odessa. Her shorter fiction has appeared in Slice and Montana Noir. She learned about the American Library in Paris while working there as programs manager. She divides her time between Montana and Paris, and today she's joining us from beautiful Montana. So welcome, both of you. We're so delighted to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much. I'm a big fan of Janet's, so I really just want to talk about the Paris Library, but I won't.
Well, thank you, AJ, and thank you, Daniel, for having me talk to AJ today. I have been so excited to talk about her books, which I love. And I think I'll start with the question. When I first read Yours Cheerfully, I was struck by how timely this novel set in World War II England is. During COVID, women all over the world have struggled to find childcare and to balance work and family. Were you surprised by this parallel? And can you speak about the similarities of women working in factories during the war and childcare in the time of COVID?
Goodness, yes. Thank you. I think the odd thing was that I was writing Yours Cheerfully. I came up with the idea before the pandemic began, and it became an interesting time in terms of writing about a period of great challenges and great loss and trauma at the same time, where a very different scenario was playing as I wrote, but with huge loss and trauma as well. So it's always an area that, as you can tell, I slightly I'm hesitant about drawing parallels, because there was so much loss in the Second World War, and there continues to be such loss at the moment, that as a writer, it seems a subject that deserves much thought, rather than me sort of cheerfully talking about it with the book. But there is no doubt that the role of women, it is very odd that 80 years after the book is set, we are still talking about women and childcare challenges, not only in a time of a pandemic, but in general. the basis of their book, just as, shall I give a little bit of background on Yours Cheerfully with the plot? Young Emmy Lake is a would-be journalist. She's working for Woman's Friend, which is a women's magazine in 1941 Britain. And she is very keen to make her mark as a journalist, but she is also extremely dedicated to her readers, and is part of the problem page called Yours Cheerfully. And Emmy's big break comes when the British government, the Ministry of Information, calls together representatives of the women's magazines in the country and asks them to support and join the recruitment of women to the war factories, armaments, and all the other parts of supporting the military. And this is what happened in this country. At the end of 1941, female conscription came into force, and young women who didn't have children had to either join the services or do some form of war work. And in the novel, Emmy is absolutely thrilled to bits to get to do her bit and try to help get more women into the factories. Hundreds of thousands of women were required. However, she soon meets a group of young women who work in one of the war work factories, and she finds that the reality of young women, particularly mothers and widows, war widows, is a very different scenario to the propaganda that is all terribly gung-ho and come on girls, you can do it. And so the whole of the book is based on a continuation of a theme of friendship, but her heart wants to help these women and the readers, but her head and her real need to be a good patriot and help with the war effort means that she's put in a really difficult position. And the reason why childcare became the centre of this book, which makes it sound really serious, but really the issue came when I met an amazing woman, Joan, who told me that one of her earliest memories during the war was when she was about 4, and she remembered playing in the factory where her mum worked. And I was, of course, somewhat shocked to hear this. And Joan said, well, if your mum couldn't get childcare, then you had to go to work with her. And that stuck, as a writer, that stuck in my mind. You know, as you know, Janet, you get that kind of, ooh, sort of feeling. There's something in this. I don't know what it is yet, but that's interesting. And I then started researching the issue. And one of the things I do a lot for my research is reading old news magazines like Picture Post. And I saw quite a lot of articles and letters about this issue of young women saying, look, we want to work, but how are we going to look after the children? We're doing shifts in the middle of the night. Our husbands are away, or we don't have a husband anymore. And we can't do this. We need more support. And the government hadn't really thought it through, or had just assumed that there'd be another female family member or a neighbour to look after the kids. And so it became apparent to me that many women who not only wanted to help the war effort through a patriotic desire, but actually had to financially, you know, it wasn't a choice, for as it isn't today. You know, women have to work, and the country just wasn't really set up for this. And so this is how the whole issue came to be a central part of the book, not least, and this will sound a bit weird possibly, but I always say that my sort of editor starts not with my real editor or my agent, but with the characters. It's a weird thing where my fictional characters decide whether or not they like the plot. And I was writing this, and as I found out more and more about young women who had a really tough old time during the war in Britain, I just thought, Emmy, my central figure, she will feel passionately about this. She will want to be in this story, and that's where it all started. In terms of childcare today, I'm not a mother, so I've never had to address that issue, but certainly it is always the women who, well, not always, but it is often the women, based on my friends, who have to sort that out. But I didn't think about that parallel when I was writing. My tiny brain can only just about manage to research the issues in the book without thinking.
Well, I think it's more a question of no one saw this coming. I don't think it's about brain capacity. I think even the most talented novelists could not have predicted what is going on in the world. I just love listening to you talk about your book. Would you mind reading a short passage very quickly for us? I'd love to hear the characters come to life.
Yes, absolutely. I'll read. It's about half a page, but this is just to let you know. This is at the very beginning of the book, and for anyone who read Dear Mrs. Bird, you'll be familiar with the characters at the Women's Friend's office, and this is just to reintroduce everyone to the gang who Emmy works with. And it starts off with Emmy's friend Kathleen, who is one of her fellow workers at the Women's Magazine, and they're talking about the next issue of the magazine. We have 10 ways to update an old hat and an ever so easy men's pullover where you hardly get out of a basic stitch, Kathleen said, her green eyes earnest. Lots of readers wrote in liking the feature on outsized coats, and Mrs. Stevens has come up with a marvellous pattern for a knitted brassiere using unrationed yarn. Honestly, Mr. Collins, people will be chuffed to bits at that. I see, said Mr. Collins, our editor, who tended to be foggy on knits. Yes, said Kath fervently, thinking he shared her delight. That will perk everyone up. There was a moment's silence. Right, said Mr. Collins. Mr. Newton, who'd been staring fixedly into his tea since Kath had said the word brassiere, looked pained. Nurse Maclay has had lots of letters asking how many coupons people need for maternity brassieres, said Mrs. Mahoney, which didn't help. I'm just saying in case Mr. Newton could get some advertisers in on the subject. Mr. Newton looked as if he didn't want to in the least, but nodded weakly. That's a bit of a taster.
Oh, lovely, lovely. My mother and I both love your novels and think that you write beautifully about friendship. And she asks if you were inspired by the friendships in your life.
Oh, thank you. Yes, is the short answer. Absolutely. I don't think I realised that when I first started writing Dear Mrs. Bird. I'd discovered an old magazine and thought I'd really like to write about that. But as soon as I started writing some dialogue between Emmy and her best friend Bunty, it came really easily. And while none of the characters are based entirely on real people, I realized that the relationship of friendship is firstly a lovely thing to write about, and secondly, it's something that almost everybody can understand unless they're very unlucky. The best friend is such a wonderful relationship, and I was quite inspired by my mum actually and her best friend, and they've now been best friends for over 75 years, which is even longer than my mother's been married to my dad. And I think that really fascinates me, that we all have friendships, many of which can be the longest voluntary relationship in our lives. We don't have to see our friends at Christmas as you have to for a family, and we're not married to them, so there's no legal requirement to like them for very long. Yet, and we all have different things happening in our lives, but still we elect to keep in touch and share the biggest moments of our lives. So it's, I think, a wonderful thing to get to write about and sort of cherish, really, in writing. The new book actually is dedicated to my friends, because they are the reason Emmy and Bunty exist.
Yes. Yeah, so I think a lot of people put a lot of time and effort into romantic relationships, especially when we're younger. And I think this book is an ode to friendship and a reminder to give as much time to your friends, as much time as they give to you, and to really keep those foundations solid. I note that the title of your first book is The Salutation of a Letter, and the title of your second novel is A Closing. Can you talk about how you choose your titles and how they reflect the theme of communication in your writing?
Yes, to be honest, the first book, Dear Mrs. Bird, my agent came up with that title. I'm rubbish.
When you submitted it?
Oh gosh, it was a rubbish title. I'm really useless at coming up with the titles.
Me too.
And it was during, there was a real fashion for having very long titles, you know, the quirky exploits of a little old man down the road kind of titles. And I think it was called something like The Secret Helpful Letters of Emmeline Lake or something. I mean, you'd need a really big book to get it on the front. And my agent sort of very kindly went, no. Why don't we just call it Dear Mrs. Bird? Because so many of the letters in the book start with that. And I thought, oh yes, that's loads better. So I was thrilled with that. And Yours Cheerfully, I think I really like the word cheerful and cheerfully. It's just such a jolly word. And I had years ago, when I was first starting to practice writing, I'd had a blog, which absolutely nobody read, called Where Things Are Mostly Cheerful. And that's where I started sort of learning and finding my voice as a writer. And so I sort of had that in my mind. And when in the book, the team were trying to think of a name for the new advice column, it just all fell into place. So I have no idea what the next one's going to be called. I'll worry about that when it's ready.
I will, and I was thinking, what other parts of a letter are there if it's a continuation of the story? Because I did think that was an alpha and an omega. I thought it was very interesting. Well, have you ever written to a stranger for advice? And do you read modern day advice columnists?
Oh, I've never written for advice, although I do remember as a pony mad kid, I wrote a letter to the letters page in Pony magazine over here, which was, I've still got it somewhere. And I wrote this really pompous letter about horse riders saying thank you to motorists on the roads. And it sounds like I'm about 80 writing. And another thing, riders should always say thank you wherever they are, so yes, that's the closest I've ever come to writing for advice. It was more me sharing my 11-year-old's views on equestrianism.
And do you read modern day columnists then or not?
Do you know, I tend to read because I collect old magazines, I read the old problems. So I have, I think it's now 500-600 old magazines. The house is sort of, it's all a bit Miss Havisham, but the upstairs in the spare room, which is my office, it's just absolutely full of old magazines. I think the oldest one I have is a volume from the 1760s, which is very Bridgerton. And so, yes, I'm fascinated by the letters going back from 200 years ago plus, because some of them they're just like us. It's women mostly worrying about love and life and their careers and their family, and nothing much changes despite the huge cultural changes. So yeah, my head's stuck in the past a bit on that front.
When I was growing up, I read Dear Abby, which is an advice column here, and secretly I've always wanted to be an advice column because I love telling people what they should do. But luckily I turned to writing.
Yes.
And not telling people what to do so much. What surprised you most about those vintage advice columnists that you read while researching the book?
I think actually probably their humanity, because when I first started looking at old magazines, you know, it's quite easy to find them quite amusing. That cliche of keep calm and carry on and buck up and crack on and all that British stuff. And certainly the the advice in the sort of late Victorian, early Edwardian era is pretty tough stuff. You know, it's kind of get on with it. And that's where Mrs. Bird, the character, comes from. So someone from a far more austere era is put into the modern world of the 1940s. But in the magazines of the World War II period, sometimes they're tougher than we perhaps would be now. But it's I'm always surprised by the sympathy that they give to women. As the war went on, you can see in the magazines there are more letters about unplanned pregnancies, for example, and people, you know, whose husbands have gone away fighting and they've fallen in love with somebody else and found themselves in very difficult and sad circumstances. And surprisingly, there's the answers are less judgmental than I would have thought. And in fact, in one magazine, I can remember them saying, we've had letters of complaints saying we are being too nice to women who are in this situation. And I remember one particular very moving letter from an advice from a columnist, where a woman had written in, a woman in her 50s, and she had lost her husband and their only daughter in an air raid, and she'd been badly injured and had been looked after by friends, but essentially wrote to the magazine saying, I don't really know how I'm going to go on. I've lost everything, everyone, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And the reply was not keep calm and carry on. It was really beautiful and saying, look, you know, your friends have looked after you. They need you, they want you around, because it was quite clear that this woman was really close to giving up. And the advice continued, you know, you can just keep going and perhaps try this or become involved in work. But at the very end, it said, you know, I hope you can be with your friends, but let me know, write to me again and tell me how you're getting on. And that I thought was particularly moving, because the magazines used to get hundreds or even thousands of letters a week, and to say to this person, and obviously when the advice columnists gave an answer, they weren't just answering one person, they knew they were answering hundreds of women with similar problems, quite potentially. But that struck me as a lovely thing, when they just were essentially saying, look, if you don't have anyone else, there's me, keep talking, exactly what we would hope to do now. So yeah, that's lovely to be surprised by that sort of message.
I was really touched by the letters that the magazine received, you know, and just as you mentioned, these women are in such dire straits, and so much of World War II is talking about the battles or talking about deaths on the battlefield. And so these books do a wonderful job of reminding us about people at home and how they got on, and the women, how they dealt with solitude, how they dealt with the questions that they had. There were a lot of very young women, some girls writing in, not having answers to, you know, things that we just Google very easily today.
Yes.
And you know, they were confused because they heard things from friends and just weren't sure, and they looked at these magazines as kind of a resource or a voice of wisdom. And so it was really lovely to see those letters taken seriously, and it was very heartwarming.
Thank you.
I did think this book was a balancing act, and I wanted to ask how you navigate between humor and heartbreak, between romance and friendship, and the difficult days of World War II.
I think I try in the first, I don't know if you find this, but in the first draft, I try not to think of anything very much, because I'm just finding my way and meeting new characters and although I do quite a detailed plan of the plot, I try not to overthink, because that's something I tend to do just generally. But the humor and the sadness, I mean, if it was up to me, I would just write books where everyone would have a lovely time and they'd all go out on day trips in a bus together, and it would be lovely and smashing and nothing much would happen, but it would be good fun. But then it probably only sell about 3 copies. And so
I'd buy one.
Thank you. Oh, that's my mum, you, and but yes, I do. As a reader, and I think about what I like as a reader, I think perhaps we all want to be put through the mill a bit, and you know, it's nice when the characters are happy, but they have to go on a journey, they have to learn and develop, and there must be challenges and there must be heartbreaks. But so I put them in because that's what writing is about. But particularly in the first book, Dear Mrs. Bird, without putting in any spoilers for anyone who hasn't read it, there are some really super happy scenes in there, and then it gets, the second half of the book is far more serious, and there's some quite a lot of sad stuff. And when I was writing some of the happier scenes, I found myself with tears just pouring down my cheeks, because the characters were so happy and they had no idea what was going to happen to them next, and I could find myself delaying the next scene. So the editors were like, well, that chapter's 8,000 words, it's about twice as long as it should be. And I had, you know, people going to the toilet, people doing their makeup in the mirror, people having totally unnecessary conversations because I didn't want it to get to the sad bit. But, you know, I think it has to be done. And I try not to, as I say, I don't think about it. I just go, okay, this stuff, just be in it, typing in the moment with the characters, and somehow it just sort of comes through. And then I'm really lucky that the editors will say, actually, that's a bit of a choppy change, or, you know, just flag up some stuff earlier so people don't go, oh my word, I thought we were having fun, you know, what have you done? So that smoothing out comes in the second or third draft. And it's like weaving, isn't it? It's kind of, you have all the different strands, and you've got the plot must-haves, and then the friendship sort of bit that goes through, and then the challenge that we have as historical writers is, if there are real life events, you've got to include those and make sure that if something happened in March 1941, you haven't got them all wearing summer dresses and your plot's going marvelously, and then you go, oh crikey, that's got to happen when it's in the middle of a really tough spring. And so it is, I think, weaving everything, and then hopefully at the end you stand back and go, okay, the tapestry seems to work, hopefully.
Yes, no, I think it does. And I think your books are very uplifting. And I think you use humor to shine a light and to keep the books light, but to shine a light on you know, some very sad, dark events and some very scary emotions, you know, loneliness, fear, worry about children. So I really admire that balancing act that you did.
Oh, thank you.
Researching the working conditions of women during World War II must have been fascinating, from the factory workers to the lumberjills who cut trees in the forests of England. Can you talk a little bit about the research process?
Yes, it comes from lots of different ways and sources. The best, as I've mentioned, is by far is when I get to speak to someone who can share their memory of the period, and that doesn't necessarily have to be something factual as much as a spirit, or something that I quite often get asked is, people are going to dances and having fun, and you know, your books are set in one of the worst times ever, but they're quite cheery. Why is that? And that's because one of the reasons for that is because people still lived, you know, and as we know now, through the darkest of times, we still try to have fun and some light, and and people still fall in love, and they still try to celebrate in the worst of times. So yes, that's important. And I've forgotten what I was answering the question of. I'm so sorry. What did I start to say?
No, that's fine.
That's it. Thank you.
Research.
Sorry.
Research. You were saying that the
water,
spirit
not
is
gin.
just as important as the.
Yeah.
As the,
sorry. The research.
Yes.
Yes. Once I've got that spark, and I do get the spirit from women I've spoken to, in terms of the factories, one of my favorite things is finding books that were written at the time, and finding I have one book which is sort of like a thick pamphlet, which is essentially a kind of a beginner's guide to working in an engineering factory. And so I read books, how-to books. I have another one about a sort of a handbook for people joining the fire service in the 1930s, and so I try to sort of read what they would read and see what they would have seen. And I also, I obviously read non-fiction books and reference books about the time. And for this particular book, Yours Cheerfully, I read several books by commentators at the time who were speaking about the situation of women in the factories because of this issue, that they were struggling with childcare, or they weren't paid the same as the men. Many of the trades unions at the start of the war, at least, didn't allow them to become part of it. Women didn't have equal reparations. If a woman was injured in an air raid, a civilian, and a man was injured, exactly the same injury, the man would get more compensation than the woman for the same injury. I mean, there are all sorts of wildly unequal scenarios. And so I like to try to access books that were written at the time, so that I can say, that's what they were arguing about. And also some of the the diaries that have been published of women who were working in the factories, and some of the mass observation research that took place, where they have accounts of women workers saying what they liked about working, and quite often what they didn't like, and all that sort of thing. So trying to dig through to the reality rather than having a sepia tinted view of what it might have been.
Wonderful. Well, let's turn to a Q&A from audience members. Thank you for writing in with your questions. Our first one comes from Germany, which is really exciting.
Wow.
And it's from Heike. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And she's wondering if your book will be available in Germany and when.
Oh, thank you, Heike. I hope so. Dear Mrs. Bird was published in Germany, and I don't know whether Yours Cheerfully will be or not. I hope so. That would be lovely. Although I always really admire the translators, because how they manage to translate some of the old-fashioned phrases I use is beyond me. They're amazing.
And we have another question from Judy. She says that she read and loved Dear Mrs. Bird when it was published, and she'd listened to the audiobook version, and she wonders if she should listen again before she starts Yours Cheerfully, and she wonders how much time has elapsed between Dear Mrs. Bird and this new book.
Oh, thank you, Judy. Yes, if you have the audiobook, that's probably a good idea. I wrote Yours Cheerfully so that if anyone reads it who hasn't read Dear Mrs. Bird, it will make sense. That sort of, if someone sees it in an airport or if they're going somewhere, it is a standalone story. But I have heard of readers sort of doing almost like when you binge watch TV, rereading Dear Mrs. Bird and then going straight into Yours Cheerfully, which sounds good fun. There's not too big a gap between them. Dear Mrs. Bird ends in about June 1941, and then we pick it up in sort of September 1941. And there's a little prologue just explaining what's happened in the intervening few months. And then off they go. So the action is it's through the autumn and ends around about Christmas. In 1941 in Yours Cheerfully, which was also a great excuse to kind of have some slightly Christmassy bits in it. It's not a Christmas book, but as you know, Janet, there are a couple of scenes in it that are quite cheerful.
Yes,
I'm trying not to give anything away. It's really hard, isn't it?
It is hard. We have another question from Deborah, who wonders, were books written at the time censored to keep negative aspects out of the public eye?
Yes, Deborah, I think that's really interesting. Lots of the books, the novels that I read are very, they are very cheery, and they are quite patriotic, and yep, it's going to be fine, and let's keep going. Certainly, it was against the law to be writing anti-patriotic stuff. So anything that looked as if it had any kind of a sympathy with the Nazis, then yes, that wasn't allowed. So, and there was tons of censorship on all sorts of stuff. So one of the things I had to do in Yours Cheerfully was to have the Ministry of Information slightly involved when Emmy starts reporting on factories. It was important that they go through it's a boring bit, so we didn't put it on the page, but it's clear that she has to jump through some hoops to make sure that things were passed by the censors that she was writing. And also with photographs as well. I love collecting photographs from the time, and you can get hold of press photos as well. You can find them on eBay actually, and quite often you'll get a photo and it will have it stamped, you know, not for publication, the censor and that sort of stuff. So yeah, there was tons of that. I mean, in the first book there's a scene set in London where there's a major bomb which actually happened, but it wasn't reported in the press. They were really super wary of giving any information or anything that would give the Germans any information that they had been successful with their air raid. So say a popular restaurant did have a bomb, but it wouldn't say if anyone died. So all of that was happening all throughout the war.
Thank you. I have to say again how much I loved Mrs. Bird, and I want to say how lucky we all are today to have an author with us, because we can ask questions. So please don't hesitate to ask those questions. This is my personal question, not for anyone else, but I need to know. I was very angry with the callous colleague at the fire station, and I wanted to ask you, was there ever a question of the girls confronting her for her casual cruelty and her choice to come in to work late that kind of set off a chain reaction of events? I was just, and yes. I was wondering if you as the writer were, or what your thoughts were on that.
Yes, that's such a good, that's Horrible Vera, isn't it?
Yes, I don't want to do any spoilers, but yeah.
Yes, Horrible Vera is just a baddie, and I may bring her back to be a baddie at another time. It's not on the page. I don't know about you, but I quite like I'll run through scenes and other stuff and backstories in my head if I'm doing the washing up or driving somewhere. And yes, everyone has a backstory, and Vera's is a complicated one. But sometimes, as much as you try to make the characters three-dimensional, sometimes people are just horrible, aren't they? I mean, at work, sometimes you work with someone horrible and they're just, you don't kind of try and have any depth of feeling for them. You just say, well, that wasn't very nice. But I don't know, I think, I can't really say much because of spoilers, but the situation that happens is so overwhelming that I think Thelma would probably have punched her, but that isn't in the book. But I like the idea of people being really cross with each other and sorting it out, but you can't put it all in, can you? Because it would have slowed down the story. But no, she does deserve her.
Absolutely. No, I was very curious about that. I do have another question from a viewer. Will your next book continue Emmy's story? And do you know what will happen in it yet?
It certainly will continue the story. Yes, thank you.
And this is from Kristen. Thank you, Kristen. Oh,
Thanks,
go ahead.
Kristen. Yes, it's I mean, I'll carry on writing these books for as long as people want to read them. I would love to write more, and to have a series of several more books. But yes, it will. I'm doing the weaving bit at the moment. Actually, I'm doing the again, not mentioning any names, so I don't spoil anything from Yours Cheerfully. But I'm working out. It's almost like having a graph, and what people are happy, which people are happy when, and where people are and where they might go. And so I know some of the things that are going to happen, but not all of them. I know the very last scene of the very last book. Whether or not I'll be allowed to write it remains to be seen. I'll write it. I don't know, just have to hope people want to hear it.
Well, what a gift to know what to write towards. I think that's really wonderful to just know what you're writing towards and have that strong idea in your head. I love the names Emmy and Bunty, and I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how you named your characters. I just find that their names fit them so well.
Emmy is Emmeline Lake, and her middle name is Hope. Emmy was born in 1918, and Hope was very much a name which is, as it says, looking forward to the future. And Emmeline is because her mum and her grandmother are both were both suffragettes in the early 1900s, and that's who she is named after. And one of the things that I really liked about Emmy, and it's her it's her sort of backstory, is I'm fascinated with, if your mum was a really brilliant active suffragette, how was it to be their daughter, that generation that came after? If your mum was essentially a radical feminist, how were you brought up? Because we kind of go, 1920s flappers, 1930s depressing, 40s the war, 50s Stepford wives, 60s groovy people. But actually, how interesting. And so Emmy's mum and grandma are suffragists who want women to be heard, and she's brought up with that quite bohemian side of the family, put together with her dad's side. He's a local doctor, so she comes from a very loved, very strong middle class background. So she has the confidence that comes from that, together with the more sort of political view that people really must be listened to. And this is why she becomes this kind of optimist and an idealist who thinks that you have to try to make a difference. So yes, that's a long answer to one name, but yeah, that's the sort of that's where. And Bunty is just a really jolly name. Her real name's Marigold, a pretty name for a pretty little girl. And Bunty is just a good sidekick's name. Very, yes, it's a good solid British name from the time.
Well, Daniel is asking us to talk about your different book jackets. We can see behind you that we have the US and the UK covers.
Yes, I'll hold them up a bit closer. Yes, this is the wonderful jacket for the US, and which the publishers have been so clever with. We were talking about this before we came on air, that in the US, there's a sort of a particular look for historical fiction, which is this really lovely sort of slightly sepia, really, in fact, beautiful books. I don't know if this is your US or your UK one, but here's a lovely book. So that beautiful, Janet's beautiful book, which is just so classy, and then you have an elegant woman on it, and it's just lovely. And what the publishers did with this was to kind of, they've got the girls looking quite animated and looking as if they're having a bit of a laugh about something they're reading. And I think that's ever so clever, because the books are quite funny as well as anything else, which is slightly different from a lot of novels based in the war, obviously. So they've been super clever doing that. And then in Britain,
well, and we see really the closeness. We see the closeness of the girls. We see the importance of the printed word. We can even imagine that might be Emmy's paper or a magazine, you know, research, and we see the cities. So
the little type.
Yes, the type, you know, just like with Dear Mrs. Bird, we have the element of the typewriter. So I do feel like that cover really embodies the book in such a beautiful, insightful way.
Yes, they've done a beautiful, beautiful job. And then the UK one, they have done an equally beautiful job, but a very different sort of market, which is the crease, a very different graphic representation. And again, and I don't have a Dear Mrs. Bird to hand, but that has the same sort of typeface. And this is, I mean, I always joke and say that the great thing about this is you can see it from the moon. You know, when you walk into a bookshop, it's really, really easy to see the title, which as an author is perfect. So it's it's done in an old letterpress style, so it's actually raised embossed, and they have these end papers, which are really lovely little typewriters. And so with this, again, the publishers wanted to have something that maybe even subliminally gives an idea that there's a funness to these books as well as them being historical novels. So really clever. I think the designers are extremely clever. And I was doing some bookshop tours here a few weeks ago, and it was every bookshop I went into, they said, oh, we love the cover. And so by the end of the day, I just laughed and said, everyone loves the one thing I had nothing to do with. I can take no credit for either of these beautiful jackets. They are definitely works of art.
Well, we have another comment from Judy here, and she's saying, if this is number 2 in a series, will there be 3 or 4? And you kind of answered that a little bit. As long as people are interested, you'll keep writing. I hope so. And she says, at some point the war ends, and what are you mulling over? What else are you mulling over? Well, I'm sort of spoilt for choice, really. I think I'll definitely stay in the historical genre, and we have some interesting characters in my family history who I would love to use as inspiration. They were a colourful bunch who did lots of very different jobs and had adventures. And then there are also, I quite like the idea of doing spin-offs with 1 or 2 of the characters in the current series of books. That would be fun to share the backstories that I'm very familiar with. So, but I might go back. I'd love to write something based around the French Revolution. That would be amazing. Partly as an excuse to just go off to France and stay in chateau. Research. Yeah. Judy asks a follow-up question. What does AJ stand for? It's Amanda Jane. Very much a 1960s name, and I the only people who call me Amanda are my parents, really. When I went to university, someone shortened it to AJ, and it's stuck ever since. And I was really pleased when the publishers were happy for me to be called AJ on the book. They didn't say you have to have a female name or anything. So yeah. There we go. And Daniel says, ooh, the end papers on the British edition are so beautiful. And I absolutely agree. I had another question. You talked about your blog, and you talked about that moment where you read these magazines and just got the idea this is more here. And I was wondering, were you always a writer, or did you come to it later? I loved writing as a child, and I used to I remember having a poem published. Oh, actually, no, I won a certificate from a newspaper when I was about 11 for a poem about a bus station, and peaked early, didn't write anything else. Oh, dreadful poetry as a teenager. I mean, horrific, awful.
which and then I used to write sort of what would now be called fan fiction when I was about 17. And gosh, this is making me sound really ancient, but I would write this stuff by hand, and then me and my friends would sit, we were quite nerdy, we'd sit around and then read it out, and it would be adventures involving us with characters from a TV drama. So I loved doing that. And then when I went to university, and I didn't write again for over 20 years, you know, that and it wasn't until I sound so old. It wasn't until emails were invented that I realized I really enjoyed writing to people and slightly editing things to just make a sentence, the rhythm of a sentence, sound better. And then I went on a writing course, just as you would any kind of hobby, and thought, crikey, I would love to see if I could write a book, because, you know, so many of us do, and it all went from there.
Okay, thank you. I wondered if World War II fiction is as big in the UK as it is in the US.
I think yes, it's very popular here. In fact, I said this to someone the other day. I was once asked, I was doing an event in England, and in the question bit, a gentleman put up his hand and said, "Don't you think there are enough books about the war? Why do we need yours?" Which made me laugh. And I said, well, we don't really need mine. And we don't need any books about anything. It's just nice to have them. And I think there are, I mean, obviously we have a huge interest still in the war. And my generation grew up with our mums and dads had been kids in it and that sort of thing. But there are always different new voices to be heard about everything, aren't there? So as long as there are new takes on a period, then I think it's that, you know, the world can always do with more books. You don't have to read them, but it's nice to have them. And I'm just grateful that people sometimes choose mine.
Well, I know that I wrote with blinders on. I wasn't really looking at the market and what was being published. And so when my book was accepted for publication, I was surprised at how many World War II books that there are out there. But I think, just like, as you say, so many of them shine lights on women's accomplishments and things that we didn't know about and things that we didn't really consider. And so many of them have parallels with today that I find them a pleasure to read. So it's
yes, it's always so interesting to see a new one, and there's something for everyone. The more military end of it for some people, or there can be thrillers. It's there's always a new, as long as there are people telling stories, there's always going to be room for them.
Yes, no, I agree. We have another comment from Judy. She says spin-offs, that sounds like fun. So yes, I hope that you'll keep writing these stories of these characters that we've become so fond of and have enjoyed spending time with and have welcomed into our hearts.
Oh, thank you. I'd love to. They are like real people to me, so it's a joy to get to sit down and write with them again.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to answer my questions. I appreciate it.
Oh, Janet, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us. I know we've all spent the last year and a half on Zoom, so I really, really appreciate you all for watching, and thank you to Daniel for inviting me. So, and hooray for your local high street bookshops. That's what I say.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. We're so honored to have both of you, and much success to come. We can't wait for the further adventures.
Oh, thanks, Daniel, and thank you, Janet. Wouldn't it be nice if one day we can all be in the same country?
Yes.
Let's make it Spain. I don't know.
Well, yes, why not? Yes. There are a few more comments. Thank you for doing this from Deborah. Gracias from Mexico, and a great idea, Daniel. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you, guys. I'm rubbish at looking at comments at the same time as speaking, because you'd have had an hour of me going, which would not have worked.
Well, the good news is I actually will send you the comments afterwards.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.